welcome. My name is Mark Weitzel, and I will be talking about best practices for OpenSocial in the enterprise with some of my colleagues here. By way of introduction, I work for IBM, part of their strategy and technology team, and I'm also an officer of the OpenSocial Foundation. As we get going, you can follow along with Google Wave. There's the bit.ly, and we have the bit.ly link on the bottom of the slides, so you don't have to worry about remembering it now. And the hashtag for all you Twitter guys is OpenSocial. So we'll do a little bit of introduction, background, make sure we level set on what OpenSocial is, how it works, and then we'll talk about where we can start applying that inside the enterprise in some interesting ways. So what is OpenSocial? When we think about it, it really breaks down into three big things. The first big thing is it's a social graph, social API. So it has a data model for profiles and people, but it also has a Web 2.0 component model. It allows you to take these components and move them around inside of applications, so you can do some very rich application embedding, and that's the gadget part of it. So if we think about the social data model, this gives a standard representation because OpenSocial is an open foundation. It provides a standard representation for profile, people, the relationships, and feeds or activities, and we'll talk a little bit about activity streams later on, but they're activities. It gives a standard representation for those things. And it's also easily extensible. So if you have some information, particularly in enterprise context, it's easy to extend that model. And if you abstract that out, what you're really talking about, it's a connected graph of people, and those are fundamental to the way business works. The other thing that we have inside of OpenSocial is a set of these core APIs, the social APIs that you can get from both JavaScript and via REST. So you can use the JavaScript API in the gadgets to get access to people, and when you're doing things where you don't necessarily have JavaScript, you can get access to that same information via REST. If we talk about, for example, in gadgets, we've got a basically HTML, CSS, JavaScript model that we wrap a little bit of XML around, and that gives us a way to modularize and create a standard component, and we can take that component and move it around into different websites that we call containers. So things like iGoogle, MySpace, all of those things are what we would call social network containers. But we can also take that same technology because there's an open source reference implementation. We can take that same technology and we can use that behind the firewall to build really interesting apps and get that same modularization. And again, the JavaScript APIs for accessing that information, for accessing people, is available in JavaScript. There is a reference implementation available in open source called Apache Shindig. It started, part of the technology that was donated by Google was some of the gadget technology that they had, but it's important to remember that both OpenSocial and Apache are not Google-related efforts. This is really a community effort that we have. We have an open foundation that's made up of a number of member companies. Google is one of them, MySpace, several others, as well as an open source project that's run at Apache, so anybody can contribute. So that's a very important thing as we start thinking about how we take this forward. This really is a community-driven effort. In Shindig, you can have a Java or PHP server. You have both of them, so you have your choice of technology there. And Shindig is widely used and widely deployed at most of the social networks. So it's important as we think about this to understand how gadgets work. One of the key pieces of technology is that the social container, the thing that provides the social context to the application that you're embedding, does not necessarily have to be on the same server. They can be, in fact, spread across the firewall, if you will, or even outside your enterprise. And that's very important because this allows some very interesting application embedding scenarios. So if you have a business relationship between enterprises, you can surface that relationship using gadgets. So what happens when when the page loads, somebody comes in and they get to a browser, the browser makes a request, say you're loading up a dashboard, for example, and then what will happen is you'll go into the gadget rendering part of Shindig or your OpenSocial container. It will fetch the gadget definition, which is simply an XML file around CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. It'll fetch that, it'll return it and process it, and then send that back down to the dashboard. And then you can turn around and make another request, if you will, to the gadget rendering service to get some social data and return that all back. Now, this flow can actually be optimized in the 1.0 and 0.9 versions of the spec through data pipelining. So you can take that whole thing and make that one time, and you don't have to do this constant bouncing back. What becomes very interesting, though, is as we think about that application running inside the browser, what you end up having is one place to get social context and another place to have business logic. And so if you think about all of the applications that you do inside of your enterprise, where you have people, relationships with people, and the things people do, and now you have a way to get that information from one place and use it with business logic from another place, it becomes very, very powerful. So I can take business logic from a business partner or another part of my organization, I can bring it in and I can complement all of that with some social data. And it's important that we don't think about necessarily friends in the traditional senses. Helen and I are friends, but it could be that Helen and I are colleagues collaborating on a presentation for Google I/O. Helen works for Cisco, I work for IBM, and the things that we do and the people that we interrelate with can be reflected in that kind of social network as well. So speaking of that, we started about a year ago. It was last Google I/O where we did an initial enterprise OpenSocial session. It was a collection of us that got together, really looking at this component model, recognizing the value that a standard-based component model would have when you could take this and move it around the web and deploy it in context, right? Have that social context. And we started thinking about how we can work together to kind of have a collective voice around, you know, guys, you started this in the consumer space and it worked really well, but as you move into the enterprise, there's a couple things that we need to start looking at. And that was the result that we started talking about. And it turns out that, you know, Jive and Atlassian, Cisco, SAP, you know, we all have the same sorts of concerns. And we said, this is a way we can work in the open, transparently and collectively to advance this specification, because interop works good for all of us, right? That's a shared goal that we have. So one of the things that we did was we started, we had a meetup in September, and we started working on this white paper, thinking about, you know, how do we go off and define? And these are some of the folks that participated in the white paper who have, you know, either proof of concepts or are interested or looking at, you know, things around OpenSocial and how we do it. Some of the folks that are on there actually have implementations of that and are using that as well. And so this was the result. We put together an enterprise OpenSocial white paper, and we really looked at this through the lens of, if I'm sitting behind my firewall and I'm in my enterprise, what are the things that I need that OpenSocial doesn't have? We need to think about manageability. The kind of interoperability that we have has to be better, because our customers aren't going to have the, well, it kind of mostly sort of works over here, and there's just little things that are off. So interoperability, portability, security, which Mark Halvorson will talk about, and then tooling, right? It has to be easier. There was a session earlier about being able to build OpenSocial gadgets easier. So tooling is another aspect. So these are things that we identified, and we don't necessarily have all the answers, but these are the kinds of things that we're working towards collectively as a group. So one of the things that I get to do in my role at IBM is I get to do a lot of early prototyping and early looking at technology. And that's part of my role in the strategy and technology group, is to look at this and understand how and what we can do with these emerging things in the market. So one of our goals has always been about aggregation, right? This has been the focus of IBM for a long time, and we did portal aggregation and JSR 168, and it works great, right? And we even went so far as to say, you know, okay, now that we've got, you know, portlets and we can bring these things together, how do we get them when we have different kind of portlet servers? And so we can do things like WSRP, the remote portlet stuff. But now what we've started to see is, you know, we're doing aggregation on the client, and how do we start thinking about aggregation on the client? And this is really getting into the AJAX model, right? The CSS, the HTML, the JavaScript. And so how do we start thinking about that? And so as we look around, we are building, and our customers are building these very rich apps, you know, with things like Dojo and jQuery and Scriptaculous and those sorts of things. And if we think about bringing gadgets on top of that, well, now we get a little HTML, little XML wrapper around that, and we get some very, very interesting and additional capabilities like OpenSocial markup language that we can use, or a gadget lifecycle. When things are added to the page, when things are taken off the page, we get some callbacks there. We get the OAuth that's already in the specification. We get things like data pipelining and features. So that little shell of XML and the fact that we've got a container to interpret that brings a lot of value and can start standardizing on how we can move these components and these embedded applications around on the web. And that gets more fun when you start thinking about the social APIs and having the social context available to that application. And again, let's not think about friends, if you will, but people and people being connected to people and the things that those people do. And that's a large part of what we've got here in OpenSocial is a nice abstract way to think about those things. And then you can complement that with the kinds of things like media items, which are your videos, things like that. So you can start having a standard programming model for these things. And because that standard programming model is there, you can do this inside the browser, inside these gadgets. And if you're dealing with something like a hybrid app, well, we can push that down and render that on a smart client, right? A smartphone kind of thing. Or if you want to build a native app, there you go, you can use the REST APIs. So one of the things that we've done at IBM is we have a product called Mashup Center. And one of the things that we've found is a lot of companies have an initiative like this on their own. In IBM, we have one that we call iWidgets, and a lot of our products are done with iWidgets, which aren't really the same as OpenSocial gadgets. And so it's important that all of these things start to interoperate and can communicate. So they all need to be treated as sort of first-class citizens. And so one of the things that this demo will show is, if I'm in a business context, and we just took healthcare, as a random example, this could be retail or it could be travel and transportation, but what would we start to look at? What would something like this look like? So we mock this up using our Mashup Center product. And what's going to happen is, if I click, I get a demo here. There we go. Okay. So what's going to happen is we go through this is you're going to see that I can take, regardless of the type of component, so that happens to be one of our internal iWidget type components, and I can add a feed and I can bring that up. That's from the CDC. And the other thing that I can do is I can start to build these rich mashups. So I can take these OpenSocial gadgets, these iWidgets, and I can put them and lay them out using the Mashup Center product all on the same page. And what you're going to see is one of the things that we're working on right now is we're working with a technology that IBM did in the Open Ajax Alliance, which is another open foundation, to build Ajax components. And there's an underlying technology here called the Open Ajax Hub, which allows you to do secure eventing between components in the browser. So I can do secure eventing between two OpenSocial gadgets. I can do secure eventing between two iWidgets. I can do secure eventing between an iWidget and an OpenSocial gadget. So now I can build these very rich, interactive mashups using this type of technology. And so we're doing a couple of things. We're taking the eventing piece, that core technology called the Open Ajax Hub, and we're bringing it inside of Apache Shindig, and then ultimately we'll write the spec around what does an event look like for the gadget. So you can actually have that as a formal part of the API. And so what you're going to see here is, in this example, this is really simple. It's a patient list, right? So here are the patients that some Dr. John Doe is going to see for the day. And so if you've used Shindig, you'll recognize George and Janie and those guys, because this is just pulling some sample data from the sample container inside of, or the sample JSON database that comes with Shindig. And what's going to happen is, as I start to build this up, I'll select on Janie, and you'll see the data populate in the back, and that uses that eventing mechanism. And all of this is in OpenSocial. So what we interpreted as friends is a doctor and the patient list, right? So that's one way we can show that abstract API here. And again, you see I selected it, things populate, and life is great. So you can start to see how we can put all of these things together to get this very rich experience. We can look at the abstract social model and apply that in a business context. Okay? So now I'm going to turn it over to Mark Halvorson, who will talk a little bit about security. Mark?
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. I'll keep it easy for you guys. My name is also Mark. I'm Mark Halvorson. I'm the Chief Imagineer at Atlassian Software. So now that Mark's shown us some of the things we might want to do with gadgets like this, let's start talking about how we're actually working with these technologies in the real world. So a componentized model like this is a great way to write small UI components and bring them together in a context that relates to what the user is trying to do. So things like a dashboard or a wiki page can now have rich content that's coming from back-end systems. But when you start to try to write these small UI components, you're always faced with the same challenge inside an enterprise, and that's that these back-end systems are going to require some sort of authentication. If you're trying to pull data from an Oracle or from SAP or from some other system, you're going to be challenged for credentials in order to get that information. Now, in the past, there's ways to work around this, whether you prompt the user for the username and password and pass that on to the back-end application, or if you happen to have an SSO solution in-house, like that's great, things will work automatically. There's lots of different ways you can kind of work around this security challenge. However, all of these different solutions have one thing in common. When you're asking the user for these credentials, you're authenticating to the back-end system. You're actually authenticating as that user. That means that the gadget itself can do all of the actions in the back-end system that the user could do by themselves. So that could be bad. If the gadget were to go and change your password, for example, it could completely lock you out of that system. So in an enterprise, when you're talking about enterprise systems that actually run the business, like SAP or things that have your financial numbers, it can hinder adoption of things like these dashboards or gadgets if the CFO or somebody has to hand over their credentials, because that could be a liability. So there has to be a better way, and that way is through OAuth. So OAuth is actually authentication at the API level. So instead of handing over your credentials and letting a gadget behave exactly like you in the back-end system, with OAuth, you're granted a token that will only allow them to interact with certain APIs on the back-end system. It's like a valet key for your application, as it were. There's a lot of nice things about OAuth. It's an open standard. That means that everybody's doing the same thing. So as Oracle's writing REST APIs or SAP's writing REST APIs, we can all kind of be on the same page as how we're authenticating to the back-end system. And how that's nice with OpenSocial in specific is that it's just baked into the specification. So in order to get a REST endpoint on a back-end system to work with an OpenSocial gadget, you simply have to tell that gadget where the endpoints are for the OAuth authentication. And then you hand off all the complexity of getting that authorization to the container itself. So it's literally adding these 3 lines of code to your gadget specification, and you're able to be OAuth enabled. So how this looks to the end user is when they're presented a gadget that is not authorized to the back-end system, the gadget will ask the user to authorize the gadget. When they click the button, they're actually passed off to the other application where they enter their credentials. So they're never actually giving over their username and password to the gadget itself. It all happens within the application that they're trying to work with. After that application gets the credentials from the user, it then asks the user to authorize the gadget. And when they authorize the gadget, they're actually going to authorize only the APIs that that gadget needs access to. And then finally, they're redirected back to the gadget. So Atlassian itself has widely adopted OpenSocial inside of all of our products. So all of our products currently are OpenSocial gadget producers. And then we have OpenSocial containers inside of Jira and Confluence, which means that you can have dashboards or create wiki pages with rich gadget content out of the box today. One of the areas that we're working on within the Enterprise OpenSocial group is that, while OAuth is great on many levels, there are still some little niggles about how you work with OAuth. So if you place, for example, in this case, on one Confluence page, 2 gadgets that point at the same back-end system, you're going to have to authorize each gadget independent of one another. That's because each gadget runs inside of an iframe and is completely walled off from the context within which it runs. So that can be kind of a hassle for the end user, because that means they have to authorize each individual gadget one by one. So we're looking at ways to modify the specification to make it so that if they authorize one gadget on a back-end system and another gadget from the back-end system is on that page, that both get authenticated at the same time. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Helen, who's going to talk a little bit about how they're reusing existing infrastructure inside Cisco.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. My name is Helen Chen from Cisco. I'm the engineer manager. So I'm going to share with you some of the experience we got when integrated with the existing systems. So before you start, you really need to think very carefully about your deployment plan. For example, your existing application, what's the relationship with the new OpenSocial application you are going to develop? And also the gadgets inside your firewall, does it need to access outside services, or outside services need to get some information from your services? And also, what's your IT policy for this? Do they allow your server to do a server-to-server call from your server machine? And how about through the proxy server? All those kind of things you need to think through it before you start. Otherwise, you probably need to redesign the whole architecture. So, of course, when we are doing all those kind of things, we also facing some kind of challenges over there when we designing and implementing our social applications. For example, the standard, even though the standard mentioned the people information could be extended, but it doesn't address the granular role-controlled authorization. For example, some of the gadgets, you probably only allow them to access by your financial department, or some other gadgets may be only available for the sales department. Secondly, for the user ID, from the specification, it doesn't tell you too much about how the user ID looks like. And in the enterprise world, you probably only have the single user ID, how those things could be addressed. And thirdly, the inter-gadget communication. Those things will be addressed in the future release. I mean, you are here and we are here to work together to make that happen. And thirdly is the guidance for extension. All of us will provide some kind of service from there. But what that kind of extension, the detail should be. The guidance for this extension will improve the interoperabilities, even from the extended APIs. So this is some other lessons we learned. You already have people's information in your LDAP server. Why you ask the users to input to fill their profiles from scratch. If you look at most of the social app, they monitor your profile, how many percentages they have been filled. You could see that kind of challenges. Most people don't really like to fill their profile. So we find out since the LDAP already have those kind of information, so we extended the person services from the Shindig, and from that, we get all those kind of LDAP information automatically for your users. When the user first time log in, they'll get pretty much 80% of their profile filled in. And they are automatically synced with the backend server every night. Of course, we also extended the social API juice module to bind our implementation with that interface. And also, the enterprise extension, when you create your services, I'm very sure you are not simply create another social app. You add your unique values to it. How you do that? From Cisco's experience, we basically create the new POS services, and also with this kind of template, looks like the first part, the POS services, and then gives the GUID, which is the email address, and then the service ID, and followed by some other parameters. Currently, we support the response data like XML and JSON. The whole thing works. So below, I'll do about like 2 minutes demo. In front, there's about 30 minutes. Something like the marketing, like those kind of demos, just ignored. The reason we put that one in front is because we want to provide the relevance why what Cisco doing is relevant to the OpenSocial, and what's the OpenSocial helped us. Yeah. Could we get the sound? I'm not sure. Don't play.
Cisco Pulse is an innovative search and analytics platform that taps into real-time information flows over the network and discovers the collective expertise of an organization. Cisco Pulse allows you to search for people with experience with the specified term. The people found in a search are ranked by their net pulse, which is determined by the tagging of emails and web traffic, as well as rich media that is shared across the network. In addition, Cisco Pulse finds relevant documents and videos for the specified term.
Cisco Pulse leverages and extends OpenSocial in several ways. For example, companies typically store user data such as name and corporate address in their LDAP directory services. Cisco Pulse can leverage this LDAP data and in turn make it available through its People API.
The real power of Cisco Pulse's OpenSocial implementation is the portability of the feature set to other containers. Through extensions of the existing OpenSocial APIs, the search and analytical services of Pulse are available via external gadgets. By leveraging OpenSocial, it is possible to easily integrate Cisco Pulse's intelligence into a user's workflow.
So let me hand it to Matt. He will address more OpenSocial enterprise challenges.
All right, so the one thing we practiced was our transitions. Can you guys tell? My name is Matt Tucker. I'm the CTO at Jive Software. I'm going to cover a couple of specific challenges about using OpenSocial in the enterprise context, and then I will bring it home and we will open it up for questions. So I'm going to cover another OAuth topic. One of the fantastic things in the consumer world is the simplicity of monolithic services. There is only one iGoogle, there is one Facebook, there is one Twitter. And if you guys have ever done any development using OAuth against Twitter, for example, you know that to interact with any Twitter user, you, as a developer, go to the Twitter website, register for an OAuth consumer key and a consumer secret, and use that for everyone. Now, unfortunately, that just doesn't quite exist. That same model doesn't exist in the enterprise world. For example, Jive SBS, which is our product, there are thousands of implementations of our product, and a lot of them are behind the firewall. And so consider what that means for a developer with the OAuth model. Essentially, as a developer, you need to go to every single Jive instance and register for an OAuth consumer key and consumer secret. That's an explosion of complexity, and it's much, much harder because you have to deal with the firewall issues. So obviously, this is not a good situation. There should be a solution. One possible solution would be OAuth 2.0. It's an emerging specification. It's starting to go through the IETF process. Facebook recently launched part of their social graph API using OAuth 2.0. And it's possible to use the SSL certificate methodology in OAuth 2.0 to make it simpler to do that negotiation. But that doesn't, there's another possible solution that we are looking at. And essentially, it's to somehow make all these different Jive SBS instances look like one monolithic service. And two advantages to that. One is we solve the OAuth problem. It is now you register as a Jive instance when you're first setting up as an administrator with a public cloud secure data connector. And then as a developer, you go register with the cloud service once. You get one OAuth consumer key and consumer secret. And then you can use that to communicate with any Jive instance. So we solve the OAuth problem, and we also solve the firewall problem because the secure data connector is also will let you do the communication through the firewall. Now, of course, we have to make sure that we're handling security the proper way, and that if you want to communicate with a gadget on a particular Jive instance, that you're actually authenticated to do that. But once you get that all working, this is a much simpler model for developers. All right, another issue with OpenSocial. We're kind of crazy in the enterprise world trying to use a consumer-defined specification, perhaps. So I pulled all of these words from the actual OpenSocial spec, and you'll see things on here like whether you're a smoker, your favorite TV shows, your body type, whether you drink. These are not necessarily enterprise-friendly concepts. All of it's optional, but there is a little bit of work to do in order to take what was defined in the consumer world and make it work well for the enterprise. Of course, that it was done for the consumer world is the whole reason that it's simple, and that's why we all find it very interesting. It's a very simple programming model and much better than anything we've had in the enterprise before. So what are some of the things that we are doing in order to address the fact that it is a consumer specification? First, the group of us and the larger enterprise OpenSocial working group are doing some efforts to define some business-friendly profile fields as well as activity verbs. So as you do an action like file an expense report, what kind of verb would you use for that? Another thing that's fantastic about OpenSocial itself is that extensibility is built in. Helen talked a little bit about how Cisco has taken the extension mechanism in OpenSocial to add access to their own data. So the fact that that's built into the specification itself makes it much simpler for vendors like all of us. There's also a technology in OpenSocial called OSML tags. It's a simple templating system. If any of you have programmed against Facebook with FBML, it would look fairly familiar. And that system is extensible as well, so it makes it very easy to add container-specific OSML tags. And then finally, one effort that we're all excited about is ongoing work to merge together the activity streams specification with OpenSocial activities. And there's a lot of good work going on right now. I think I saw the first patch for the Shindig open source project to integrate with some activity streams pretty recently. All right, so what are we working on with the actual OpenSocial spec? The 1.0 release just came out fairly recently. We are targeting the next release of the spec after 1.0 for the end of the year. And a few things that matter a lot to us in the enterprise working group. First is to solve the inter-gadget communication problem that the first Mark talked about. So make it possible to securely share data between gadgets on the same page. Second, we want to solve some OAuth issues. One in particular is installing multiple gadgets on the same page and only having one OAuth request flow, which the other Mark talked about. We definitely want to be ahead of the curve with OAuth 2.0 as well. And so the plan is to try to have some working code. And then as the OAuth 2.0 standard goes through the IETF, we'll be ready. Don't know quite exactly when that will all play out. But our intention is to be ready so that we can move to OAuth 2.0 when the time is right. And finally, it should be possible to view gadgets through mobile. And so we wanted to find a mobile view for the gadget specification so that it's possible to consume gadgets from mobile devices. So what do we want you to leave this session with? First, that OpenSocial is an open, standards-based, and most importantly, Web 2.0 style of building apps and gadgets. So it's HTML, it's CSS, and JavaScript. This is simple. If we think about what's been in the enterprise for a long time, JSR 168 portlets, really? This is far simpler, far better, and that's why we're all excited about it. Second, that there is enormous opportunity for this technology and for social in general in the enterprise. There are going to be a lot of domain-specific social networks. We saw one example of that with the patient-physician social network that Mark talked about. And finally, it's easy to use this technology to leverage what you already have. Because it's HTML and CSS and JavaScript, that means you can take your existing enterprise apps, turn them into gadgets in a very easy way. And all of us as vendors are also trying to make it very easy to leverage things like your existing LDAP backend in order to build out the social graph in a simple way. We have collected a few resources if you're interested in exploring more. You can find these in the slide deck later. In particular, the white paper that Mark mentioned is a great resource. Talks a lot about why we think this specification is very important in the enterprise. And with that, we'll end a little bit early. Thank you so much, and we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, hi. This is not an enterprise-specific question, but a more OpenSocial generalist question. I'm implementing an app that pulls together contacts and events from different networks like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all that. So currently what I'm doing is using OAuth for each of these networks, and then using the APIs that each of these networks provides, REST APIs. So my question is there any benefit of looking at OpenSocial API to access data? And what's the advantage versus using the custom API? Because it seems to me that you lose some power. And the second thing is, what do we do with Facebook? Thanks.
All right, I'll start an answer, and then we can pass it down, perhaps. So why use OpenSocial? Why? So let's say you have OAuth, and you can bring together all the social web services together. The hope is write once and use it with many different social networks. And the fact is, OpenSocial isn't tremendously successful in the consumer web. It is adopted by almost every social network except for Facebook, but it's not Facebook, so that does limit its usefulness, perhaps. In the enterprise world, specifically, the ability for a developer to write a single application and to have that work in all of our different containers, that's very important. It prevents vendor lock-in, and makes programming simpler. And it's true you can always use the proprietary APIs in order to grab the social data, but it is a fairly rich API that OpenSocial provides, and so why not use it? It's pretty elegant, and get as far as you can there, and then build a little bit of extra stuff if you need access to the container-specific data.
I think it's also important to recognize that OpenSocial is an open community and an open standard, right? So you're not locked into a proprietary API. That's one of the things that we found very good working together, is we can come and to say we need to advance the specification this way, whether it's mobiles or some of the gadget communication or extensions to profiles for enterprise. So being able to work in an open environment, being able to engage openly and have some say in the direction, I don't think we can underestimate that. Other questions?
Don't bore us. All right.
Well, a number of us have spaces in the sandbox. Please feel free to stop by, ask questions, and you can see some of the things that we're working on there. Thank you very much for your time.